All right, welcome to the Class 7 video for critical thinking. In this video, I'm going to introduce the arrow diagrams, and I'm going to be using a few examples from the movie we will be watching, 12 Angry Men. Actually, in the class that I shot most of this video for, the students had already started watching the movie. But in this new version, I'm just going to show isolated snippets from the movie and use them to illustrate the differences between standard form and arrow diagrams. So I'm going to start by showing a quick clip from the movie. This is Juror 3 explaining why he thinks the kid is guilty. It's early in the movie, and it really isn't a spoiler.
Here's what I think, and I have no personal feelings about this. I just want to talk about facts. Number one, the old man lived downstairs under the room where the killing took place. At 10 minutes after 12 on the night of the killing, he heard loud noises. Said it sounded like a fight. And he heard the kid yell out, "I'm going to kill you." A second later, he heard a body hit the floor. Ran to the door, opened it up, saw the kid running down the stairs and out of the house. Called the police. They came in, found the old man with a knife in his chest. The coroner fixed the time of death around midnight. Now, these are facts. You can't refute facts. The kid is guilty. I'm just as sentimental as the next fella. I know he's only 18, but he's still got to pay for what he did.
I'm with you.
So Juror 3, like a lot of the jurors, likes to say the word fact a lot. He says, now these are the facts. You can't refute facts. The kid is guilty. And a lot of times people just like to say fact, 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 and try to bully you with that word. But what you need to focus on is what is actually confidently known and what isn't. So when Juror 3 starts listing facts, the first thing he lists are premises in his argument. These are facts in the sense that both he and his audience, the other jurors, agree that they are true. The old man said all these things in court. The last thing the juror says is, the kid is guilty. He's asserting this as a fact, just like the others, but really, this is the conclusion he wants you to draw from his previous statements. He says you can't argue with facts because he's trying to silence his opposition. But really, in this case, you can argue. You can argue with whether the first statements, which are accepted as facts, imply the last statement, that the boy is guilty. Basically, everything John Corvino said in his video about facts and opinions applies here. Juror 3 says fact because he wants everything he says to be contrasted with opinion. But really, from the perspective of critical thinking, these are all just statements. And some of them are premises and some of them are conclusions. And we can argue about the inference between them. And as we shall see later, we can argue about the interpretation. Okay, the speech that he gives is pretty long. I've got it copied out in the slide. And if we want to put it in standard form, we're going to need to paraphrase and simply focus on the points that get picked up on later. So this is how I broke it down. The way I see it, Juror 3 has 3 premises. And essentially the argumentation scheme we are working with here is argument from authority or testimony. So here are the premises. P1, the old man testified that he heard what sounded like a fight. P2, he said he heard the defendant shout, "I'm going to kill you." P3, he said he saw the boy running away. Therefore, conclusion, the boy committed the murder. Now, we could simplify this further and say that we could make it one premise. The old man was a witness. Or we could actually break it up even more by bringing out the implicit premises. I'm just going to keep this level of detail here now because this is, we need to specify exactly what the old man said in order to interpret it. The other thing that we need to see is that this fits the argumentation scheme for an argument from authority or testimony. This means that there's certain questions that we have to ask of it. Was the witness in a position to know? Are they biased? Is what they said confirmed by other witnesses? All this will come up in a little bit. But right now, I just want to look at a different way to represent this argument. So, standard form just separates premises and conclusions. What we're going to do now is arrow diagrams. And arrow diagrams allow us to see the relationship between the premises. So to see how the arrow diagrams work, let's just look at the simplest possible case. So somewhere in the back of your mind right now, you're going to make an inference like this. And you make it so fast you don't even notice it. You go, today is Tuesday, so tomorrow is Wednesday. And actually, it's Wednesday when I'm recording this, but it doesn't matter. You know what I mean. You make a simple inference from one premise to one conclusion. You do it automatically and unconsciously. So your premise, today is Tuesday. Your conclusion, tomorrow is Wednesday, right? So if we want to represent that with an arrow diagram, what we just do is we have, we number the statements again. We make the premise 1, and we draw an arrow from the premise to the conclusion. So this is the simplest possible version of the arrow diagram, and everything else is sort of going to be compounded out of this. You know, you just draw an arrow from a premise or set of premises to the conclusion. Now think about an argument like this. Standard classic example of a deductive argument. All people are mortal. Socrates is a person. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? If we want this is an argument with two premises. And if we want to represent it with the arrow diagram, we do it like this. We put the two premises on top and we write a plus between them and a line across the bottom. And that is because in this case, the premises are conjoint. Statements 1 and 2 together support statement 3. That is to say, we're now representing something not just about the premises. Now, we're not just representing that 1 and 2 are premises. We're saying another thing about them. We're saying that those two things work together. That is, neither on their own would be sufficient for the conclusion. All people are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal doesn't work. You need the additional premise that Socrates is a person. Okay, so for conjoint premises, both premises are necessary in order to have sufficient reason to believe the conclusion in that context. To get a better sense of what this means, let's look at two additional concepts: the burden of proof and the standard of proof. So the burden of proof, it's a technical term, but it's pretty straightforward. It's the obligation of one side of a debate to prove their case. And then if the burden is not met, either the other side wins or the case is undecided. So this is actually a simple thing to understand because it makes perfect sense in 12 Angry Men. They say in 12 Angry Men, the burden of proof is on the prosecution, right? And that is standard for American criminal cases, right? So this is an easy enough concept to understand if you just keep your mind on the context of a criminal case. In a criminal case, we have innocent until proven guilty. That means that the burden of proof is on the prosecution. Now, what happens with the concept of burden of proof is that in other situations, it's not clear where the burden of proof is. It's not laid out in the Constitution. If you're just talking with someone, in a bar or in a classroom, we don't have constitutional rules about where the burden of proof is. And so sometimes this can lead people to fall for bad arguments because the speaker will dump the burden of proof on you when it's really on them. And we'll get to this again in a second. So we need to talk about the burden of proof. In a criminal case, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The standard of proof is the amount of evidence that the people with the burden of proof must produce. And again, we've got this is a straightforward idea in a criminal case because the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? And that is, again, a long-established part of American law. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, and the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, there are other standards of proof that you will sometimes see. Among other things, when we talk about deductive validity is actually a standard of proof that is higher than a reasonable doubt. When we say something is deductive, when we say it's valid, we say that there's no possible way the premises could be true and the conclusion false. So this is the standard of proof typically used in math, right? And it's an incredibly high standard of proof, and it's not something you ordinarily see in the real world. In the real world, even when we're looking for a high standard of proof, we're still being inductive. So one of the highest standards of proof you would see in an inductive context is the reasonable doubt standard. And that's what's typically used in criminal trials. If the premises were true, no reasonable person could doubt that the conclusion is true. You can make up crazy things. What if he was killed by space aliens? But no reasonable person would think that. A lower standard of proof is the preponderance of evidence standard. And this just says that if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true than not. And this is actually used in American law in civil trials rather than criminal trials. So if you've ever been wondering about the difference between, for instance, a death penalty, a murder case and a wrongful death lawsuit, one big difference is that the wrongful death lawsuit is a civil case, and it's going to use the preponderance of evidence standard. Okay, so one quick thing to note is that all of this is introduced in the movie really quickly because the audience in the context of a jury trial will understand the concept of burden of proof and standard of proof quite readily. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the arrow diagrams? Well, let's go back. Remember, in this arrow diagram, I said that the two premises work together to support the conclusion. We call that a conjoint diagram. Well, now we can say something pretty specific here. With conjoint premises, the two premises together are sufficient to meet the standard of proof, but neither is sufficient on its own to meet the standard of proof. Right? So once we have the idea of a standard of proof and burden of proof in there, we can explain exactly what's going on with the conjoint premises. Together, they give you sufficient reason in this context, whatever the standard of proof is, to believe the conclusion. The contrast to conjoint premises are independent premises. And we draw them with an arrow diagram like this, where 1 and 2 have separate arrows going to the conclusion 3, right? In this case, either 1 or 2 on its own would be sufficient to meet the standard of proof in that context. So in this situation, you've got a backup argument, right? You've got two arguments. If one fails, you can still rely entirely on the other. So this is actually a stronger situation to be in than you're dealing with with conjoint premises. But most of the time, though, reality is more ambiguous than that. So let's look at a simple example. Imagine that a principal is giving a tour to prospective parents for trying to get them to send their kids to this school. The principal might say, McKinley is a good school because it has dedicated teachers and modern facilities. So here we've got the indicator word because. We know that the two premises after that, or the two statements after that, are premises. The school has dedicated teachers and modern facilities. Well, how many of those would be sufficient to prove the conclusion? It's just ambiguous. Where this isn't a court case, we don't have the kinds of clear-cut rules of discussion. So for this, we're going to use a third kind of diagram. We call it an unstructured diagram, like this, where somehow the premises come together to support the conclusion, but we don't really know how. This is a little bit different than the way most textbooks present the arrow diagrams. This was an innovation introduced by my colleague Cahill Woods, who also was a co-author for some of the portions of the textbook that we're using. So with unstructured reasoning, it's simply unclear how many premises you have to include before you have sufficient reason to believe the conclusion in this context. All right, so now we have 4 basic forms of diagram, right? And these are going to be the elements that we use to represent longer arguments. We're going to put these together in longer and longer combinations to represent more and more complex flows of argument. So the simplest case is just one premise, one conclusion. The premise supports the conclusion, you have an arrow. In the conjoint case, 2 premises work together and require each other to give you sufficient reason to believe the conclusion. In the unstructured case, it's not clear what the relationship between the premises is. Maybe they function independently, maybe they don't. And then in the independent case, it's explicit that either premise on its own is sufficient to warrant believing the conclusion in that context. Okay, let's go back and look at the argument from Juror 3 now and see how to represent it with an arrow diagram. So we saw that with ordinary standard form, we just separate premises and conclusions, and so we have 3 premises and 1 conclusion. But what is the relationship between the premises? We need to know how many of these premises the juror believes would be necessary to remove all reasonable doubt. Is it just enough to say that the old man heard what sounded like a fight? Well, it can't be that on its own. Is it just enough that he heard the defendant shout, "I'm going to kill you"? No, it's not even probably just enough that he saw the boy running away. Actually, for this full argument, we're probably going to need to include the fact that the body was found right afterwards. But in any case, it's not clear how much of the old man's testimony the juror thinks is enough to remove all reasonable doubt. So what we're going to do to represent it with the arrow diagram is we're going to use this fantail diagram, right? So we've got 3 premises, 1, 2, 3, and they come in a kind of a fantail going down coming together, and then there's one line going straight to arrow 4, and all that says that the argument is unstructured. We don't know the details of the structure. So again, we have 4 basic elements. The simplest one is a straight line for 1 premise, 1 conclusion. The conjoint form looks like a T. You've got 2 premises both working together to get the conclusion. The unstructured form looks like a Y. In this case, we don't know how the premises relate to each other. And the final form is a V, which indicates that the premises are independent. So either one on its own is sufficient to meet the standard of proof in this context. Okay, so the other thing that I alluded to earlier is that these basic diagrams can be strung together to represent longer arguments. And to show you how that works, I'm going to pull out a couple more arguments from the opening of 12 Angry Men. Okay, this is from Juror 6, and he's giving his contribution to the overall argument that the boy is guilty.
Oh, well, I don't know. I started to be conventional very early in the case. You see, I was looking for a motive. That's very important, because if you don't have a motive, where's your case, right? Anyway, that testimony from those people in the apartment across the hall from the kid's apartment, that was very powerful. Didn't they say something about a fight and an argument between the old man and his son around about 7 o'clock that night? I mean, I could be wrong, but
It was 8 o'clock. It was 8 o'clock, that's right. They heard an argument. They couldn't hear what it was about. Then they heard the father hit the boy twice. Finally, they saw the boy run angrily out of the house. What does that prove?
Okay, so Juror 6 introduces the idea that the boy had a motive. And he actually doesn't believe that this on his own is sufficient to convict the boy or to remove all reasonable doubt. But let's just set that aside and look at this argument in isolation so that we can see how arguments get strung together. So the simplest way to present his argument would simply be to have one premise and one conclusion. The boy had a motive, therefore the boy is guilty. But actually, we can break this up into parts because he gives further reasons for believing that the boy did have a motive, right? How do we know the boy had a motive? Well, the boy had argued with his father, and the father hit the boy. So now this gets broken down into two separate arguments. The first one leads to the conclusion that the boy had a motive, and then from the conclusion that the boy had a motive, we draw the final conclusion that the boy is guilty. So the argument on the bottom here is a simple arrow diagram. The argument on the top is probably unstructured reasoning. We don't know how many of these premises you would need to really think that the boy had a motive. And then we can just pile these two arguments together like this, right? Statements 1 and 2 in some unstructured fashion lead to statement 3. And statement 3 leads to statement 4. So now we can see that we can string these arguments together, these arrow diagrams together, to represent more elaborate and lengthy arguments. Okay, for my last example, I'm going to look at Juror 7. And Juror 7 is going to tell us about the boy's history. And again, Juror 7 actually doesn't believe that this on its own is sufficient evidence to convict. But I just want to look at his part of the argument in isolation so that we can talk again about stringing arguments together.
I don't know. It's all been said. You can talk here forever. It's still the same thing. This kid is 5 for 0. Well, look at his record. When he was 10, he was in children's court. He threw a rock at a teacher. When he was 15, he was at reform school. He stole a car. He's been arrested for mugging. He was picked up twice for knife fighting. Oh, yeah, they say he's real handy with a knife. Oh, this is a very fine boy.
Ever since he was 5 years old, his father beat him up regularly. He used his fists.
Well, so would I. A kid like that?
So in some ways, we can simplify Juror 7's argument the same way we did 6. And actually, when we put all these arguments together, we're going to have to simplify them like this. Simplifying Juror 7's argument, we can say that P1 is just the boy had a history of violence, and the conclusion is that the boy is guilty. That's the basic argument, but why do we know that the boy had a history of violence? Well, he has a whole bunch of examples. He threw a rock at a teacher. He stole a car. He was arrested for mugging. He was arrested twice for knife fighting, right? So again, the argument on the bottom here is a simple arrow diagram, premise, arrow, conclusion. The argument on the top is longer and unstructured and gives us the premise of the argument on the bottom. So we can represent this by putting the two diagrams together. So the first diagram becomes statements 1, 2, 3, and 4, and in some unstructured way, they lead us to statement 5, the boy had a history of violence and crime. In some ways, what's going on there is that 5 is just sort of summarizing all of that. But as we draw longer and longer arrow diagrams, we're going to see that summary statements like that are useful for representing arguments. But in any case, 5 then leads us to the final conclusion that the boy is guilty. So now we've seen examples of two arguments that have two layers. The juror 6 argument has as its top layer a Y shape, right? So the two top ends of the Y are premise 1 and premise 2. Those two come together, and then the bottom of the Y is statement number 3, which is the conclusion of the first argument, right? So that's the top layer. The bottom layer then is a line going from 3 down to 4, where 3 is now the premise in a second argument, and 4 is the final conclusion. The two-layer argument for juror 7 is similar. Instead of having a single Y shape on top, though, what you've got is a kind of a fantail thing. So there are 4 separate lines coming together into a single line that goes down to 5. And 5 is the conclusion of the first argument. Then the bottom layer, again, is a single line, this time going from the number 5 to the number 6. Okay, so those are examples of layered arguments. The next thing I want to do is make a point about the number of inferences involved in each of these layers. I mentioned before that an inference is the connection between the premises and the conclusion. When your mind goes from the premises to the conclusion, you make an inference. So that means that in these arrow diagrams, each arrow, each downward-facing arrow, represents an inference, right? So in a basic argument, you've got that one inference going from 1 to 2. In a chain argument, you've got two inferences, right? 1 to 2, and then a second inference that goes from 2 to 3. And so it'll be useful to keep track of how many inferences you're making as you go along. In unstructured reasoning, you've got one inference where two things come together, and the same thing's true for conjoint reasoning. All right, so that's the arrow diagrams, and you're going to have a homework assignment where you just have to map out some arguments using these simple arrow diagrams, and then for test 2, you will also be asked to represent things with simple arrow diagrams.